All right,
Right.
so welcome everybody to Stitching in Sources, Avoiding Quote Quilts and Sourceless Submissions. My name is Mariah. I am one of the Ally Center tutors. I specialize in writing, but I do a whole bunch of other stuff as well. And in my free time, my other free time, I do adjunct professoring as well. So I'm excited to be about to go back into the classroom tomorrow. I'm going to see some of those students fresh out of high school. So I'm excited for that. And I will be talking about this to them all semester long. So we're going to jump right in. So we're specifically talking for this workshop about research essays. At LBC, there are going to be a variety of assignments that you're given. Some of them are going to be discussion posts. Some of them are going to be reflection essays where they're just like, hey, just think about your feelings on this topic. A research essay, they're going to say, hey, this is your topic, or you can pick from amongst these topics. Go and do some research and then come back and report your findings in 3 to 4 pages, 8 to 10 pages, whatever the case may be. Some signals that you're going to need to be incorporating this research up here on the screen here. Use at least 3 direct quotes, or your essay must cite at least 8 sources. Coming up, LAN 101, that's going to be one of your assignments, your final argumentative essay, an 8-source paper. Recently, I had one, somebody came in with something along the lines of include citations from as many sources as you can. I was like, that's not very specific, but it does let you know that you need to incorporate some research into these essays. And so whenever we're doing research, this is the thing that I always struggle with. I want to figure out how to balance the right amount of research with my own voice, because on the one hand, you want to avoid what I term that quote quilt, where your essay isn't really you writing. It's just sort of, I pulled a quote from over here, and then I pulled a quote from over here, and then I pulled a long quote from over here, and I just put them all together, and it's just other sources all together. And my thoughts aren't actually there. And on the other hand, these are research assignments. And so our professors are looking for us to not just come out of our own personal history, what we think, what we feel, but they're looking for us to take what we think and support it with outside evidence. And so you want to have some sources in there. And so what we're aiming to do today is to say, hey, what are the different, how do we balance these things? And then once we sort of know how to balance out these things, how do we incorporate those sources strategically into our research essay? So that's our plan. Any questions before we keep rolling? We're going to roll. So before we take a look at anything else, we want to talk through quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing. And these are essentially the 3 different ways that you can take a look at a source and take the information into your essay. So whenever we are quoting, using a direct quote is whenever you're taking the source's exact words and you're including them word for word. We don't want to do this a lot. I think the statistic that I looked up most recently was about 10%. You don't want to have your paper be more than 10% of direct quotes. And so if you think about it, most assignments that you're going to get are going to be between 3 to 4, maybe 5 to 6 pages. And so you're going to have less than a full page of direct quotes. There are, however, sometimes where you definitely want to include some direct quotes in your writing. For example, if your source's words are distinctive or memorable. C.S. Lewis has said that pain is God's megaphone to arouse a deaf world. That's very memorable. If I just said something like, oh yeah, God uses pain a lot to really grab our attention because we're going through suffering. I mean, it communicates the same idea, so it's a paraphrase, but it doesn't grab the reader's attention like it's his megaphone to arouse a deaf world. And so there are going to be some times whenever the source's words are so distinctive, so memorable, and you're like, I want to use this for my attention grabber, or I want to use this as my landing thought. Use that direct quote. Sometimes your source's words are going to be so direct and concise that a paraphrase would be awkward or wordy. So oftentimes with statistics, you're going to want to use a direct quote. It's obnoxious to paraphrase statistics. Sometimes you're going to want to, but oftentimes you're just going to want to be like, you know what? we're just going to put quotation marks around it. If the sentence that you're looking at is, I don't know, 7 or 8 words long, and then your paraphrase is like a paragraph, then maybe go ahead and go with that direct quote. We don't want to make things overly complicated. Finally, you might decide to use a direct quote if your source's words are very specific, or it's because it's their specific words that it adds some sort of authority or credibility to what you're writing. So for example, Neil Armstrong, who's one of the first guys on the moon, he said, hey, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And so if you're like, well, it's Neil Armstrong who said those specific words, maybe I want to use that because of it's him. He was on the moon. That's pretty cool, you know? And so sometimes it's just depending on who says it, when they say it, why they say it, that you want to use their exact wording. So direct quotes, about 10% of your paper whenever you're incorporating sources, no more than that. So we want to include other evidence, though. We don't want to just include direct quotes. So we have paraphrasing and summarizing, and I have these two on the same slide at the same time because really they're almost synonymous. They're not quite synonymous, but they're almost synonymous. And so if you're paraphrasing or summarizing, you're using the same techniques. Paraphrasing, I'll read what's on the screen here. When you want to communicate the key points discussed in a section, particularly a complex or complicated passage, in clear, accessible language. In other words, you have a section, it's got all these really technical ideas, and you're like, you know what, I'm just going to say this in my own words in a way that makes sense to me. If I was to get up and go to tell my next door neighbor, hey, this is sort of what this passage is about, I could do it. And what I just did is I actually paraphrased the definition that I have up on the screen. So I said it again in my own words. That's primarily what your professors are going to be looking for whenever you are incorporating information from your sources. And so if you're thinking about weighing things out, you probably want to have 2 to 3 paraphrases or summaries per one direct quote, maybe even more. Now, a summary, again, is very similar to a paraphrase. You summarize whenever you're taking the general overall and making it really small. So if I was going to summarize The Lord of the Rings, I might say something like, well, a hobbit goes on a journey with 8 other companions and he saves the world by destroying a ring. Now, have I left out a lot of details? Yes, I have left out oodles and noodles of details. I have not communicated complex ideas in a shortened way. I have just given the overall impression of the whole thing. So that's summary. I'm still putting it in my own words. That's why it's like paraphrasing, but it's more like summary is whenever you're taking a big thing and making it small and concise in your own words. Paraphrase is more like a comparable section for a comparable section. I'm not going to split hairs though. Whenever we go through and do our examples, we're not going to give separate examples for paraphrasing and summarizing. We're just going to sort of talk about them together. Any questions so far? All right, let's keep rocking and rolling. Now, what we're going to move into is just the real nitty-gritty of whenever you have found information from a source and you like it and you say, hey, I would like to use some of the information here and put it into my essay. How do I make sure that I communicate to the reader that this is from this source? So we're going to talk about signal phrases and citations. Now, signal phrases are essentially introductory phrases or sentences that lead into the source. So if I have a direct quote here, and I'm going to introduce it. So a recent study backs this up. Smith and Carell with the NIH surveyed 1,500 college students in California. And I have the page number there. They discovered that, and here's my direct quote, see those quotation marks, 89% of college students used AI in 2024. I end my quotation marks, and then I have my parentheses at the end. Now I've highlighted in blue the area that is the signal phrase or the introductory ideas. Very technically, some people would say, okay, well, the signal phrase itself is just they discovered that. But I think it's nice to sort of broaden out a signal phrase or an introductory idea to anything that you want to use to introduce the source, especially whenever you are working in a field that's using MLA citation style. MLA is all about providing context and helping your readers sort of follow along where you're going. And so if it's important that they did a study in California, I probably want to include that information in actually my lead into the source. If maybe there's a book author who has had practical experience for over 40 years in a particular field, that's information that I might want to include as I'm leading into that direct quote. And so that signal phrase right there is going to communicate that information. What I'm not going to do is I'm not just going to drop in the quote, 89% of college students used AI in 2024. I want to give it a little bit of a landing space, to give it somewhere to lead into, so that I'm not just taking my quote as a baseball bat and smacking my reader on the head with it. We want to ease them into it. Now, you can use the same essential setup whenever you're paraphrasing. You still want to let the readers know, hey, I'm getting information from an additional source. This isn't out of my head. I don't have these numbers just sort of magically in my mind. I got them from somewhere. And so you can set it up basically almost the exact same way. So for our paraphrase, a recent study backs this up. Smith and Carell with the NIH surveyed 1,500 college students in California. They discovered that a majority of respondents had affirmed AI utilization in the past year. And then I have my in-text citation at the end. Notice that I didn't change anything between these two. And so whenever you're thinking about introducing your ideas, it doesn't necessarily matter too much if you're using a direct quote or if you're using paraphrase. You can use very similar types of signal phrases in order to lead into them. This is where I think I see a lot of students struggle the most, is they want to just get the information in and just sort of do that quilt a little bit. They're like, here's information, and here's information, and then here's information, and then here's information. And what you want in, especially again, MLAs, you want there to be a journey of a sort. You're taking the reader down this journey of evidence to help lead them to your conclusions. And so you're explaining why you think a source is credible, or you're explaining how a study lends particular weight to these findings that you're exploring. And so giving the reader that extra context helps to convince them along the way. And they're actually going to be more persuaded by the extra information that you're providing with your signal phrases than if you were just to sort of smash them with pieces of evidence on top of pieces of evidence. Now I have the same quotes, so I'm not going to reread them here, but now we're highlighting in-text citations. Anytime we have information from any source, we always want to include in-text citations. So there are different ways you can do this. Whenever we're citing from a source that has an author, we're always going to cite the author's name. Doesn't matter what other information you may want to provide. So I may want to provide the title of a book, or the title of a journal, or whatever the other information is. And you can provide that in the sentence if you want to give that extra context. However, you must provide the author's last names so that you can link it then to the works cited page, which we're not going to talk about in this workshop. So you have to include the author's names. You can either do that in the sentence, like I do in the second sentence right here. Smith and Carell with the NIH surveyed 1,500 college students. And I don't have it in parentheses at the end because I have it in the sentence. Or in my final sentence right here, they discovered that 89%, and notice I have they instead of their names. And so because I didn't name them in the sentence, I have to include it at the end here. Smith and Carell 170. Now, if there are page numbers available for MLA, that's the other thing you have to include. APA, you're going to include dates as well. We're not going to worry too much about APA. Most of yours, you're doing a lot of the social sciences stuff, so you may have some APA as well. Don't forget about the dates for APA. But for MLA and APA, you have to include the page numbers, and those are going to always be inside the parentheses at the end of the sentence. It is bad form to say on page so-and-so in the sentence. And so whether you're using APA or MLA, page numbers will always be at the end, whether it's of a section Like if it's APA, you would more likely do it wherever the thing finishes, whether it's mid-sentence or at the end, you're going to put the page number. MLA is always going to be at the end. Now, a lot of students I have found struggle if there is a longer section that is from a single source, and they're like, well, do I have to name Smith and Carell every single time for every single sentence? And generally speaking, no. So if you are, for example, paraphrasing a large section and you want to include perhaps a short story that has several elements that you're going to include, and so you want to include that whole story, what you want to do is just make sure that your phrasing is still reflecting that it's from that source. So you might say something like, Smith and Carell did this study. In the study, they did so and so. They discovered XYZ. They hypothesized that, whatever the case may be. Finally, they concluded, and then you have to end with this closing in-text citation. And of course, if you're citing different page numbers along the way, you have to include those different page numbers at the end of each sentence for every time the sentence changes. I like to describe it as a sandwich. So if you have a lovely old sandwich, you have a piece of bread on this side, and you have a piece of bread on this side, and then you have the good stuff in the middle. It's the same thing whenever you're paraphrasing a section from one single author. You need to name them and have your in-text citations at the beginning, and you need to name them and have their in-text citations at the end. And in the middle, it needs to be clear that you're still referring to the same source. If there's any confusion, then what I tell my students is it's better to oversight rather than to undercite, because we don't want to accidentally plagiarize by not giving the authors credit. And you'll notice that in the paraphrase, even though I don't have any direct quotes, I'm still in this final line here attributing this idea to Smith and Carell, even though, again, I'm not using their exact words, I am using their ideas. And so when we're doing this, we want to be making sure that we're completely clear with giving our credit where credit's due. Any questions at this point? Let's keep rolling. So now we're going to talk about paragraph structure. How do you make a paragraph that has evidence included so that it's not just a wall of text that's just all from a source? We're going to examine that here. There are two different templates that I've encountered in my time teaching to structure your paragraphs. They are Test and Peel. I'm going to use Peel for our demonstration today. However, if you run across Test, you may be familiar with that from high school. That is essentially the same thing, it's just using different letters to communicate the same ideas. So our P stands for point, and it's essentially our topic sentence, and it establishes what the paragraph is going to be about. It's the director of the marching band, and all the rest of the paragraph is taking its orders from that topic sentence. Now, we haven't really talked about thesis statements for this workshop, but your thesis statement directs the direction of your entire paper. And so your topic sentence should be linked to your thesis statement. We're going to admit Judith here. Judith, welcome to our workshop. We're talking about Peel structure for our paragraphs. And so as we're thinking about our topic sentence as sort of the running guide for the rest of the paragraph, that's our first sentence that comes out of our own head because we came up with it. We came up with our thesis statement. And so that's something that we're constructing. The first E stands for evidence or example, and this is going to be from your sources. So this is where you're going to start looking and saying, hey, I'm going to use that quote from Smith and Carell, or I'm going to use a paraphrase of that section by Jones, whatever the case may be. This is where you're going to embed that information. Now, here where you're putting in the information about evidence, we're going to go ahead and admit another person. Hello, Katia. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so glad to have you in our workshop. So whenever you're incorporating that piece of evidence, you still want to make sure, as we just talked about in the last section, that you're providing those signal phrases, that you're leading into your source. You don't want to just be like, oh, this is the part of my paragraph where I put the information and then just drop it in from the sky. We still want to gently merge it into our paragraph, but this is where in the paragraph we're going to start putting that evidence in. Now, on the back end of your evidence, we have our second E, explain. We want to explain how our evidence supports our point, our topic sentence, which is linking back to our thesis statement, which is running our entire paper. It should give us more information to ensure that our reader is understanding the relevance of the information that we've included. So if I cited a statistic, well, what's the point of that statistic? What point am I making with it? If I shared a short story, maybe I'm tying together the story and the statistic, and so I want to explain the relationship between those two pieces of evidence and trying to build my case, prove my argument, explain whatever I'm explaining. That's going to be out of our own head. So the evidence is going to be from the source, although you may have some information that you're providing from yourself because you're a sort of explaining, providing some context. The explanation of that evidence should be our own thoughts. And then your last sentence, your link, should be making some connections. Anytime we're writing, we're trying to help the reader get to the place where we're all going together. We're going on this journey together. And so you want to remind them, hey, remember, this is what the entire paper's about. This is how all of this stuff that we just talked about helps to prove my case. And it wraps up the entire paragraph. Now, whenever you are doing something like your final argumentative essay for LAN 101, where you have an 8 to 10 page paper, very often you're going to have multiple rounds of the E's in the middle. So you're not just going to incorporate one piece of evidence, you're going to incorporate maybe 2 to 3 pieces of evidence, maybe even 4. And so your peel isn't going to be like a banana peel, it's going to be like peel. It's going to be sort of a little bit longer because you're incorporating multiple pieces of evidence. Even there, we don't want to just be like evidence 1, evidence 2, evidence 3, evidence 4, bam, and then cut out. We still want to make sure that we're providing those lead-ins from one source to the next, and that we're explaining the significance of each piece of evidence on its own and how it's building on the previous piece of evidence. Any questions? All right, let's keep on going. So we're going to take a look at a sample here. So I have my P point. Also, a nice little transition there. Studies show, I can't read it, that children under 2 can face developmental delays if they are exposed to too much screen time. So that's my topic sentence. I came up with that on my own. And now I'm moving into my evidence. A recent pediatric study. And notice that I didn't have a separate sentence introducing what's going on. My signal phrase is embedded into the sentence itself. I'll finish the sentence. Also, studies show children under 2 can face developmental delays. I'm reading the same sentence twice. What am I doing? A recent pediatric study showed that infants who are exposed to too much screen time may experience delays in speech development. Smith and Carell, 179 to 180. Notice here that I have my in-text citation at the end of the sentence. I don't say anything about Smith and Carell at the beginning, so I have to include their names at the end. And this source has page numbers, so I have to include their page numbers at the end here. Now I'm explaining the significance of this evidence that I've included. I don't just include the evidence and then move on, hoping that the reader is making sense of it on their own. I'm explaining how it's related. The reason infants are facing these delays is because screen time is replacing other key developmental activities. My bar is in the way. The evidence suggests, now this is our link at the end, the evidence suggests that infants who have a lot of screen time experience negative consequences in their speech development. Therefore, they should not be exposed to iPads at such a young age. And that very last bit right there, therefore, they should not be exposed to iPads at such a young age. That's linking back to my thesis, my overarching claim for the entire paper that that young children should not be exposed to screens, specifically iPads. And so that's my link again. So if I'm thinking about the balance of how much information am I using from a source and how much am I writing? So the first line was all mine out of my head. The second line is from a source. The third and the fourth lines are both things that I've written. And so you're seeing that whenever we're writing even research essays, we still want to have a lot of the essay is going to be our own voice. But we don't want to not include evidence, because if we don't include evidence, then it's not a research essay and we're just sort of talking. And we may have some good life experience, but most of the time professors are looking for us to be incorporating that evidence. And oftentimes they do have those specific source requirements for us to be able to say, hey, I want you to include this much information in your essay. Any questions before we continue forward? All right. Okay. So that's a general rule of thumb whenever you're looking at incorporating information into your essays. You want to have about 10% that's, direct quotes. You want to have all of those signal phrases and you're leading in and you're explaining the information and making sure you have nice cushion surrounding everything. There are a couple of exceptions, and those are introductory paragraphs and our concluding paragraphs for our essays. So let's take a look at introductions first. The basic structure of our introduction is a lovely upside down triangle right here. We're always going to start our introductions, unless directed otherwise. Every once in a while, a professor has a very specific request for an introduction, but most of the time you're going to start off with some kind of hook, some sort of attention grabber. You're going to introduce the issue, maybe introduce contrary opinions that you're going to be discussing. And then the end of your paragraph is going to be your thesis statement, where you tell your readers, hey, this is what the entire essay is about. This is what I'm arguing for, or this is the idea that I'm going to be expositing about, whatever the case may be. So whenever we're creating an attention grabber, whenever we're doing a hook, it's intended to be an attention grabber, right? To grab your audience and say, ooh, that sounds interesting. I would like to read this essay. And so what we don't want to do whenever we're doing our hook is to take 7 years to explain the context of something, because we've already lost our audience. So this is the exception for something like the start of your paragraph. So if you have a quote, or if you have a statistic, or maybe a short story that you're making a lot smaller, then these things, it is acceptable to just go ahead and start it off with your direct quote, and then to have your in-text citation at the end, so that the quote itself can grab your audience and pull them in. You still need to include the in-text citation. We always want to include the in-text citation, but you don't have to have the signal phrase at the front. You can just grab it, pull it in, and then as you're explaining, the explanation is really going to be you introducing the concept that you're talking about in your essay. Any questions on that? Judith, are you moving to unmute?
I'm good. Thank you.
Super duper.
All
All right.
Reaction?
I'm so sorry. It's a little bit hard for me to hear you.
Oh, it's like multiple? Hmm.
You can also type your question into the chat, Judith, if you want.
Okay.
I can hear you a little bit better now.
Okay. No, it was not even a big question. It was about the introduction. So, does the introduction needs to balance the conclusion and length, or like?
So here's the thing. generally speaking, the powers that be recommend that all of the paragraphs in our essay be roughly balanced. That's what they say. That's what they say. However, whenever I'm teaching writing classes, I always tell my students, you want to include the amount of stuff that is required in order to communicate your point. And so if your first subclaim is really strong and you need 5 pieces of evidence to make your first subclaim's point, then use those 5 pieces of evidence. And so you might have a really long first subclaim, and that's okay. I generally recommend that people don't take a long time with their introductions. In fact, I'll recommend to my students to split up their introduction from like their context and history paragraph and take a lot of that background information and make it an entire separate section, because you want your introduction to be just that. Hey, let me grab your attention, introduce you to the issue, and tell you what my paper is about. And then now that you're hooked and now that you're following along, now you can go ahead and sort of walk through, okay, here's the context that led up to this situation, and now here are my points. So I personally exhort my students to have short, snappy introductions, and then they can take more time with their context and background paragraphs if they need to include additional details.
Yeah.
As we think about conclusions, you're wrapping up all of the evidence that you've presented in your paper. As you see, this is the triangle's now turned right side up. So you're starting off oftentimes with your thesis, and it's not your exact thesis statement copied and pasted, but instead think about it as you're summarizing your arguments. Now, generally speaking, I mean, you might take like a sentence, maybe 2, to summarize each major idea that you've made. Maybe you had a particular argument from one particular source that you're like, I need to make sure that I say this again in my conclusion because it was just such a good piece of evidence that I really want to make sure that my readers don't forget about it. But you're going to take a few sentences to do that. And then sometimes you might include in your conclusion like a powerful quote. Maybe it's linking in the ideas that you've already talked about, or maybe you start a story in your introduction and then you finish it in your conclusion. I've noticed that's a really nice way to tie in your introduction to a conclusion, is to start a story at the top and then finish it at the end. Maybe you land with a final predictive statistic or something like that. All of those things are going to be from sources. We always want to make sure that we include those citations once again. But again, for our conclusion, what we don't want to do is we don't want to incorporate new information. And so we have to be careful, if you're going to include a quote, a story, or a statistic, that it's not something new that introduces a new point. It needs to be along the same lines of what you've already talked about, emphasizing what you've already said. And so you shouldn't need to explain a whole bunch if you're already, because you're summarizing the ideas. And so again, this is sort of the exception to the rule, where you're not going to be explaining these things because it's just reinforcing everything you've already explained throughout the course of your essay. And so if you think about how long should your conclusion be, I do think that it should roughly be around the same length as your introduction. It might be a little bit longer or a little bit shorter, just depending on how you decide to land the plane. So it's going to vary. I have had students who insisted to me that they needed to have a 3-paragraph long conclusion, and I was like, I really don't think that's necessary. Like that's overkill. Take your ideas, summarize them, get them into one final concluding paragraph, wrap those ideas up, send it home, praise Jesus, you're done with your assignment, and walk away. But so that would be my recommendation. Does that answer your question, Judith?
Yes.
Super.
Yes.
And so again, with your conclusion, if you're incorporating information from a source, which you don't have to do, because in your conclusion, you're summarizing all of the arguments that you've already made in your paper. So you do not need any quotes, any in-text citations in your conclusion, unless you choose to include a quote, story, final statistic, or something along those lines. Oftentimes, because this is Lancaster Bible College, students will end with some sort of Bible verse and incorporate that in there, and that's great. But you don't have to. You can just summarize all of the things that you've made and sort of park the plane. Now, there are always, of course, going to be specific categories of assignments where a professor might say something like, hey, I want you to create like for a theology class, they may ask you to analyze a passage and to include specific sections. And so you're going to do this and this one, this and this one. And so you're pretty much just focused on reading the text and then interpreting or reading the text, including something from one or two specific sources. And in those cases, you want to follow whatever your professor's guidelines are for incorporating source information into the paragraphs. Even so, though, so the general rule of thumb that we went over here with your appeal is still a good rule of thumb, even if you're not doing something like an expository essay for LAN 100 or an argumentative essay for LAN 101. This general framework is a strong framework to use no matter what you're writing about, because you always want to make sure that you have clear topic sentences that are going to give each paragraph a good direction. If it's a research-based assignment, you're always going to want to include that evidence. You don't want to have a paragraph in your research paper that's just from your brain, because that's just not the purpose of the assignment. Again, you may have some good thoughts on this topic, but you still want to make sure that you're backing it up with at least one piece of evidence. And we always want to make sure that we're explaining those connections. We don't want to leave the reader behind and say, oh, well, yes, try to figure out what I'm saying. We always want to make sure that we're explaining the information. And it's always a good idea to provide some kind of link, some kind of transition, help the reader make sense of where you've been and where you're going in the paper. We talked about our exceptions here, so let's do a little bit of review and then we'll open up for additional questions and answers. So what do we want to do whenever we're incorporating sources for our research-based assignments? We do want to combine summary, paraphrase, and quotations from sources. So that's all of our evidence with our own ideas. We always want to have a balance. We want to compare and contrast the sources' perspectives on the issue. Maybe we're extending an idea. So if you have, again, maybe a short story and then you say, statistically speaking, this happens over 7,000 times each month. And so you sort of take that one story and then you build on that with the statistic, or vice versa. You can say 7,000 people struggle with this issue. Let me give you an example. This person experienced this, and then you tell a story to humanize the numbers that you presented. There are all sorts of ways that you can tie different pieces of evidence together to help build your case. And so it's a great idea to be thinking about, how are my sources talking to each other? And I mean, they're not literally talking to each other, right? It's not like they're standing up and walking around the room saying, oh my gosh, no, you're wrong. But they are saying something. And so you're the one who's in charge of taking these pieces of evidence and weaving them together. What story are you going to have these sources tell? We do always want to make sure that we're introducing source material with signal phrases. It can be anything from they discuss, she talks about, he explains, this study suggests, they did a study on this, and the study says. Always want to include some kind of signal phrase. What we don't want to do, we don't want to drop source material into a paragraph without providing context. No quote bombing, as I like to comment. We don't want to just take our quote and just sort of airdrop it down into our paper and have it explode the paper. We always want to give some kind of context, especially whenever we're using MLA. APA, you can get away with a little bit of just sort of dropping in your stuff. We should still explain it, but you can get away with it more for APA. We don't want to string pieces of information together without providing transitions. This is, again, what I see my students oftentimes struggling with the most, because they're like, oh, well, I want to use this, and I want to use this, and I want to use this, and they just bam, 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 and they just stack one piece of evidence on top of another, and I'm like, well, how are these things related? Tell me, explain to me, tell me what you're thinking about this, because your professor can kind of guess from, like, if you're stringing quotes together, they can kind of guess what you're thinking, but they don't know. And part of what the assignment is always aiming to do is for you to be able to show your professor what you're thinking about a particular topic. So you always want to include that information. We also want to avoid cramming too many pieces of information into a single paragraph. Now this is a general rule of thumb, and some professors will actually want more. So I can actually think of a professor who probably wants like somewhere between 8 to 10 pieces of evidence per paragraph, and they're excited about that. Generally speaking, though, if you start to see that you have 4, 5 pieces of evidence in a single paragraph, it's not a bad idea to split up your paragraphs, and you can take multiple paragraphs to make a single point. So if you have one point of your thesis statement that you're expounding upon, you can do that in multiple paragraphs. That's allowed. But so just think as a good general rule of thumb that citing from 2 to 3 sources usually is sufficient and a good rule of thumb. Any questions? Judith.
That's a big question. But it's like in a paragraph, we need like to synthesize, right? Well, synthesizing, that's how we're going to compare and contrast. But if we like leave just put our idea like our source, explain it without like a contrasting comment, will that count like as a proper synthesis or
Right. That's a good question. So, the type, and it's going to depend on what you're doing with your paragraph and what kinds of sources you have. So most often, so for example, for your final argumentative essay for LAN 101, where you're trying to argue about a controversial topic and you're trying to prove your case, most often what you're actually not going to be doing is comparing or contrasting information in a paragraph. Instead, you're using the sources to build a case. And so like the example I gave where you give a statistic and then a story. The story is building off of the statistic. It's humanizing something. Or maybe you give 2 different stories and you say, hey, this is one aspect of the situation. Here's another aspect of the situation. And then you're explaining how those 2 stories show the similar sides of an issue and how you're building pieces of your case together. And then maybe you also cite the National Library of Medicine to say, okay, and this is proven that, they're actually, it's not just people saying stuff. The actual studies have been done to prove that what they're experiencing is in fact documented. And so it might not be specifically a compare and contrast, but you do always want to build the case. So you don't just want to include a quote and then include a paraphrase, and then include a quote. You always want to have some type of explanation, some sort of transition that shows, hey, this is how we're moving from this piece of evidence to the next piece of evidence. That's a good question, Judith.
thank you.
Anything to add or any additional questions? Anybody?
Okay.
Since we're backing up here, I'll just go back over here to our, nope, I thought I was doing the backspace button. Whenever we're talking about signal phrases, this is something else that I find that students tend to have questions about, and they're like, well, how do I have to introduce my source? It can be as simple as saying Smith and Carell say, or Smith and Carell state. However, especially again, for something, whenever we're doing something in the humanities or something in literature, Bible related, you're oftentimes going to want to include additional context. And so that's why I have these additional sentences to provide that additional context, to say this is what the study was about. This is where the study was conducted. You're not necessarily going to include all of this information, but providing that context is helpful oftentimes for the reader. At your very basic, though, you always need to have at least some sort of phrase that's going to lead into the information. They discovered They analyzed and found that they state, they assert, these authors argue, etc. Something else that I'll highlight that's just grammar related. So if I have something that's in the middle of a sentence, they discovered that 89%, then I'm going to use the word that, and I'm not going to use a comma. See how it just flows straight into it? They discovered that. However, and I think, do I include? Nope, I don't. Okay, so if I instead were to say they discovered 89%, then I would need a comma after discovered, and I wouldn't include the word that. So if you're starting off a sentence and you're just saying, hey, 89% of students used AI, and that's your sentence, and you don't want to use the word that, then you have to include a comma after discovered. And if this wasn't a number, then it would be capitalized. Oh no, what's happening? What is happening? You would capitalize whatever that first letter is. If you're just doing this mid-sentence, they discovered that 89%, then you would use the word that, no comma in this. If this was a word instead of a number, would be lowercase. Extra little tidbits for you there.
Can you say it again?
Yes. And in fact,
if you like, if you after a comma, like if we didn't have the that,
yeah, let me go ahead and I will stop the share and then restart the share. And I'm going to just share my overall screen.
okay.
I'll get into this right here. All right, give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen.
Yeah.
So if I have, thanks, Katisa. So if I have, let's change this, a large percent.
Oh, okay.
So if I have, they discovered that a large percent of college students, then this is correct. So I don't have anything capitalized. I do have the word that, and I do not have a comma. So this is midway through a sentence, and this is correctly formatted. If instead, so I'm just going to copy and paste this so you can see it side by side. So now I have, they discovered, comma, a large percent. And I'm starting this as a new sentence. So A is capitalized. If I'm capitalizing the first letter, then I need the comma and I can't use the word that. If I'm lowercasing it, then I do need to use the word that, and I don't want to have a comma there.
No, I see. Well, me, after that, I will put a comma and I put capitalized.
Just commas everywhere. We're just gonna throw them in left and right. Generally speaking, if we're including a direct quote, we are usually going to have a comma before it. That's a general rule of thumb. It's just that if your quote's like mid-sentence, so if this was a quote, surveyed 1,500 college students, let's say that was word for word from the article, then I don't need a comma here because this is part of, it just flows in the sentence. So I wouldn't have a comma there. I do need it before any sentence. But if it's a sentence, then the first letter also needs to be capitalized.
Yeah, the second example you just gave, this is my usual. I always tend to start with a capitalized letter.
Oh, uh-huh.
I wanted you to explain it again because now I understand. Like if the source came from let's say a middle part of a sentence, so we need to keep it the way it is. We don't have to capitalize it.
Right. Yeah. So only if it's starting a sentence, then we capitalize. And most of the time we are, right? Most of the time, whenever we're citing from a source, we're using somebody's full sentence. And so we're going to cite it as a full sentence. So they discovered, comma, and then whatever their full sentence is. Sometimes though, we're not, we're just using a phrase, or we're coming in at the end of their sentence. And so if we're coming in at the end of the sentence, to be grammatically correct, so this isn't about paragraph construction, it's just about grammar. To be grammatically correct, we want to just sort of let it flow.
All right.
Let it flow, let it flow.
Got it. Fine.
Great questions, great questions. Anybody have any additional questions? I can't see Letha. The joys of Zoom. Okay. There, oh, Letha.
Sorry, I don't have any questions.
That is
You've
no
been very
problem.
clear.
I love it. Katisa, any questions today?
Oh, I have another question.
Judith.
When we have like an unidentified article, let's say
Okay.
certain search, you
Yep.
a good source that you can support your topics and your argument, and you don't have a name
It's a great question.
and you don't have a page number.
Yep. Excellent questions. So I'm going to get rid of both of these so that we can just sort of play with this right here. So the question is, if there is no name affiliated with an article, say you found something on a blog, or if there's something with like a group author, so you found it on the CDC's website or something like that, and there's no page numbers because you found it online. So how do you do that in-text citation? So there are no page numbers, so we're just going to get rid of those altogether. It's never going to be page numbers. MLA specifically says that you're going to take a shortened version of whatever the article title is. So if I'm thinking about, let me see if I can pull one off the top of my head. 7 ways to get rid of bugs. Got bugs on the brain. All right. So 7 ways to get rid of bugs. And that's the title of the article. I have 2 things that I can do. And it's the same thing for if I'm including their name, it's people's name. So I can either do it in the sentence. So I'm going to copy this. And if I'm doing it in the sentence, then I want to include the full article title. So I would say something like 7 ways to get rid of bugs. And this has nothing to do with college students, but says, and I might even do a little bit of an additional signal phrase and say, one online article, 7 ways to get rid of bugs, says that. And so this is going to be the first thing that appears on my works cited page because there's no author. So you just skip the author slot and you put this in instead.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how you do it in the sentence. Now, if there was, let's get rid of Smith and Carell here. You just end the quote right there because there are no page numbers for you to include at the end. Now I'm going to take this entire thing. I'm going to paste it right here. Get rid of this. One online article says that a large percent blah, blah, blah. However, I still need to include, if I don't want to include it in the sentence, I still need to include it in my in-text citation at the end. And so you're going to put it at the end. However, MLA says, hey, you don't need to include the full title because that's so long. Like, you don't need that full thing. And it's just so that people can find it on your works cited page. It's not part of your sentence. So you're going to abbreviate it to whatever the first noun is. So 7 is describing ways. Ways is the first noun. So I'm going to get rid of, to get rid of bugs. And that's still going to line up with the title on my works cited page. So if there is no page number, you're just going to skip it, delete, but you have to include something. So for MLA, they say, hey, pivot to the article title. APA is different. For APA, most of it's like split. So if there's a corporate author, so if like there's a website like the CDC, then they say to use CDC or whatever it is, and to use that instead. And so you're going to have the CDC, then the article title, and then CDC is the website. I think you're going to have it twice. It's been a hot second since I did that APA workshop. But they want, for APA, they want the actual name of the sponsoring entity, whatever the sponsor is, whoever published it, which is different from MLA. Most of you guys are probably going to be operating primarily with MLA, so you're going to cite the article title in quotation marks. APA, you would use so you would use CDC. So you would do CDC, and that's the title. So you would, I think, italicize it. Good question. Great question. Anybody have any follow-up questions on that? Or on anything else to do with incorporating sources into your essay?
Interesting. Thank you.
All right, so I hope this has been helpful for you guys. So we've talked about how we can skim through the entire thing right there. We've talked about how specifically for research essays, you don't want to just be all from other sources. You want to have your own voice incorporated, but you don't want to, on the other hand, just have all of your own voice because it is a research essay. We talked about quotes, paraphrases, and summaries, and sort of the strengths of each of those. We talked about how quotes, about 10%, summarizing and paraphrasing, professors tend to want you to do more, but you can check with each individual professor for their specifications. We talked about signal phrases leading into your quotes and paraphrases so that it's not just like, well, bam, and you have your quote in your paper. And we talked about always including in-text citations so that your readers can find the information that you were looking at. And then we talked about paragraph structure, and we especially talked about using Peel as a general structure for us to use whenever you're setting up your paragraphs. This is a template. It's not like every single paragraph that you ever write in your entire life needs to use Peel, but it is an excellent guide for especially research-based essays in college. Thanks so much for joining us. If you don't have any other questions, you can run like you stole it. But if you do have additional questions, you can hang out. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, ladies.